The wide mop head whispered across the vast, empty stage, a soft shushing sound in the deep quiet of the hall. It was late, long after the last dance class had ended and the last car had pulled away from the community arts center. For the man pushing the mop, this was the only time the stage truly felt his. A dull ache throbbed in his lower back, a familiar souvenir from his day job laying concrete under the sun. Every push of the mop sent a reminder through his shoulders, a weariness that went bone deep. The kind that 2 jobs and not enough sleep will carve into a person. He moved with a practiced, almost silent efficiency. His sneakers, worn smooth at the heels, made barely a sound on the polished wooden floor. He wasn't here for the art or the magic of the theater. He was here for the paycheck. A simple, clear transaction. He would clean this stage, wipe down 100 seats, and empty a few trash cans, and in return, he would get a little closer to the number he needed. That number lived in his head, a constant, ticking calculation of rent and groceries and electricity. But mostly it was about the ballet. He smiled a little, a private, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He thought of his daughter, her face lit with excitement that afternoon as she had shown him a new ply she'd learned. She was all knees and elbows and fierce concentration, her small body trying so hard to be graceful. He had sat on their worn living room couch, mud from the worksite still on his jeans, and watched her like she was the most important performance in the world. To him, she was. Her happiness was a bright, fragile thing, and he would do anything to keep it glowing. That happiness, he had learned, came with the price of pink ballet shoes and a sparkly leotard and weekly lessons that cost more than he thought possible. And so, here he was, in the heart of the night, pushing a mop to the rhythm of his daughter's dreams. His path was a well-worn map. He started stage left, working his way towards the wings in long, straight strokes. He knew every squeaky floorboard, every loose nail head, every scuff mark from 100 different performances. He usually enjoyed this part of the job, the simple, mindless repetition. It was a quiet space between the noise of his day and the warmth of his home. But tonight the silence felt heavier. It felt like it was holding its breath. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor ahead. On the path his mop was carving through the fine layer of dust. He had a rule, a personal boundary he never crossed. He never looked directly at the center of the stage. He never let his gaze linger on the large, shapeless form that sat there like a sleeping giant under its thick, gray cover. It was a grand piano, a beautiful instrument with gleaming white keys and a polished wood body that had once known the touch of his hands, but not anymore. Now, it was just a piece of furniture he had to clean around. He could feel its presence, though. It was like a magnetic pull, a cold spot in the middle of the warm, empty room. He could feel it even when his back was turned, a weight of memory and music that was pressed down into the very floorboards. The cover was pulled over it tightly, tucked in around its legs like a shroud. It looked like a ghost of a melody, a ghost of a life he had packed away years ago, in a box labeled, "Do Not Open." He guided the mop around the edge of the covered piano, his body curving instinctively, creating a wider berth than was strictly necessary. He didn't want to get too close. He was afraid that if he got too close, he might start to hear things. The soft opening chord of the song she loved, the sound of her laughter mixing with the music. He was afraid that the dust covering the piano wasn't just dust, but the ashes of a past that could still burn him if he let it. His knuckles were white where he gripped the mop handle. He wasn't just a man cleaning a stage anymore. He was a man navigating a minefield of his own memories. Each step was a deliberate choice to stay in the present, to focus on the ache in his back and the image of his daughter's smiling face. Those were the things that were real. The job, the exhaustion, the love for his child, that was his life now. The man who sat at that piano, the man who had filled this hall with music, that man was a stranger, a ghost he refused to acknowledge. He finished the last row, pushing the dirty water towards the stage right wing. He wrung out the mop, the coarse fibers rough against his work-worn hands. He looked at his watch. Almost 10. He could be home in 20 minutes. Just in time to see her before she fell asleep, to read her a story, to smooth the hair back from her forehead and kiss her goodnight. That was the final push he needed. The thought of her was the anchor that held him fast in the storm of his own making. He took one last, quick glance at the stage, making sure he hadn't missed a spot, but his eyes skittered right over the gray mound in the center. He saw nothing. He felt nothing. He grabbed his bucket and walked off the stage, his footsteps finally breaking the heavy silence as he headed for the lights of the lobby. The piano sat alone, waiting patiently under its shroud, holding its secrets for another night. He was almost at the heavy metal door that led to the back alley, the cool night air a promise of freedom just beyond the frame. His hand was on the push bar, his muscles already sighing in relief at the thought of the drive home. But then he stopped. He patted his pockets, then looked down at his hands, empty. He'd left the damp cleaning rag on the edge of the stage. A small thing, a stupid mistake, but it was a loose end. He was a man who tied his loose ends. He let out a long, quiet breath, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire day, and turned back. Walking towards the stage again felt different. The first time it was a destination, a task to be completed. This time it felt like he was walking back into a trap. The empty hall seemed to be watching him. The shadows in the far corners of the ceiling looked deeper, darker. His eyes, against their will, were drawn to the center of the stage, to that gray, shrouded shape. It looked like a stone monument in the middle of a forgotten field. He shook his head, a small, sharp movement, as if to physically clear the thought from his mind. Just get the rag and go. That was the new plan, simple, direct. He climbed the 3 steps back onto the stage, his sneakers making a soft, squeaking sound. The rag was right where he left it, a small, balled-up piece of gray fabric lying near the edge. He walked over quickly, bent down, and snatched it up. Mission accomplished. But as he straightened up, his gaze fell upon a dark scuff mark on the floor right by the leg of the piano. It was a black mark from a dancer's shoe, a small imperfection that his earlier mopping had missed. It bothered him. It was a job half done. He knelt down, one knee pressing into the hard wood, and rubbed at the mark with the damp rag. It was in that moment, as he was focused on that small, insignificant spot, that it happened. His hand slipped. The plastic handle of the dustpan he was using to brace himself slid and knocked, not with a loud clang but with a solid, dull thunk against the thick wooden leg of the piano. For a second there was nothing. Then a sound began to bloom in the quiet air. It wasn't a note, not really. It was a deep, resonant hum, a vibration that seemed to travel up from the floor, through the leg of the piano, and into the very air he was breathing. It was a low, mournful string, awakened from a long sleep, and it hung in the hall like a single, perfect thread of sound. The man froze. His entire body went rigid. The world, which had been a simple place of tasks and paychecks just a moment before, suddenly tilted on its axis. All the exhaustion, the worry about money, the image of his daughter's smiling face, it all vanished. There was only that sound. It was a key turning in a lock he had welded shut years ago. A lock on a door he never, ever intended to open again. The hum slowly faded, but it left behind a silence that was louder than any noise. And in that silence a memory didn't just creep in. It crashed over him like a wave. Suddenly he wasn't kneeling on a dusty stage. He was sitting on that very piano bench, the afternoon sun warming his back. The piano wasn't covered. Its lid was open and the light danced off the white and black keys. And next to him, so close their shoulders touched, was the woman he loved. Her hair was pulled back, but a few stray strands had escaped to frame her face, and she was laughing. Not a small giggle, but a deep, joyful laugh that made her whole body shake. They were trying to play a song together, a simple 4-hand duet from an old book. He was clumsy, his big fingers fumbling the chords, while she played her part with a light, easy touch. Their timing was all wrong. He would play a note too early, she would come in too late, and they would stumble over each other, creating a clumsy, happy noise that was more laughter than music. "You're supposed to play the C, not the B flat," she'd say, her voice full of warmth, and then she'd lean her head on his shoulder for a second, a quick, easy gesture of affection that meant everything. He could smell the faint scent of her shampoo, feel the warmth of her through their thin shirts. It was a perfect, ordinary moment, the kind of moment that life is built from, but the memory, like a dream, began to shift. The sunlight in the hall grew harsher, colder. The laughter in his mind began to echo, and then it faded, replaced by a different kind of silence. The image of her on the bench blurred, and for a terrifying second he saw her as she was later, in a sterile white room, her face pale and her hands too still. The warmth of the memory turned to ice. The joy of the music curdled into a profound, bottomless ache. The simple, happy noise they had made was now a ghost, a reminder of everything that had been lost. A physical pain shot through his chest, so sharp and real that he gasped. He recoiled, scrambling backward on his hands and knees like a man trying to escape a fire. He knocked into his bucket, sending it tipping over with a loud clatter, but he didn't hear it. His knuckles were white, his hands clenched into fists, so tight his nails dug into his palms. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force the images out, to push the memory back into its box. But it was too strong. The grief was a living thing, a monster that had been woken up, and it was tearing him apart from the inside. He had to fight back. He couldn't let it win. With a desperate effort, he forced a different image into his mind. His daughter. Her face, her bright, trusting eyes. The way she ran to him when he came home, her small arms wrapping around his legs. He focused on the feeling of her hand in his. He thought of her name, said it over and over in his head like a prayer. She was his anchor, his reason, his purpose. Not the ghosts, not the music, her, slowly, painfully. The image of the woman in the hospital bed began to recede. Pushed back by the force of his love for his child, he scrambled to his feet, his legs shaky and weak. He grabbed his bucket and mop, his movements clumsy and rushed. He didn't dare look at the piano. He couldn't. It was no longer an object. It was a curse. He practically fled the stage, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't stop until he was out the heavy metal door and leaning against the cool brick of the building, breathing in the night air in great, ragged gulps. He had won. He had pushed it back down. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the lock was broken now. And the ghost was awake. The cool night air felt sharp in his lungs, a welcome shock to his system. He leaned his back against the rough brick of the arts center, the uneven texture digging into his shirt and grounding him in the present. He closed his eyes, focusing on the simple, real things. The rumble of a distant truck, the smell of damp garbage from the alley, the feeling of his own heart, a wild drumbeat against his ribs, slowly starting to find a more normal rhythm. He had run. He had run away from a memory, from a sound, and the shame of it burned in his chest. He was a man who faced down collapsing dirt and heavy beams all day, but a single note from a piano had sent him scrambling like a frightened child. He pushed himself off the wall, his legs still feeling a bit like jelly. He needed to go home. He needed to see his daughter's face, to hear about her day, to wrap himself in the simple, uncomplicated love that was the center of his world. He rounded the corner of the building, heading for the parking lot where his old, reliable truck was waiting. That was his escape pod, his ticket back to the life he had so carefully built. But just as his hand touched the driver's side door handle, he heard a sound from the front of the building. The main doors, not the service entrance he had used, flew open with a bang. A woman hurried out, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice a frantic, high-pitched whisper that carried in the quiet night. "No, I understand, but the program starts in 15 minutes. 15 minutes. She was pacing back and forth on the sidewalk, her heels clicking with sharp, nervous taps. She was dressed in a nice blouse and slacks, a stark contrast to his dusty work clothes. He recognized her as one of the people who sometimes ran the events at the center. He froze, his hand still on the door handle. He felt like an intruder witnessing a private moment of panic. He should just get in his truck and drive away. It was none of his business. But his feet wouldn't move. He was caught in the gravity of her distress. "No, don't cry, honey. It's okay," she said into the phone, her voice softening with a pained sympathy. "It's just performance anxiety. It happens to everyone. But we need an opening act. We can't just..." Have silence. She listened for a moment, her free hand running through her hair, messing up the neat style. Okay, you just rest. We'll figure something out. She ended the call and let out a groan of pure frustration. Looking up at the dark sky as if searching for an answer, he watched her, feeling a strange mix of pity and a desire to help. He knew what it was like to have a plan fall apart, to have the weight of responsibility suddenly become too heavy to carry. He was about to quietly get into his truck and leave her to her crisis when he heard a small voice behind him. "Dad?" He turned. His daughter was standing there, a small silhouette in the doorway of the arts center. She must have gotten tired of waiting and come looking for him. She was holding her little backpack, her ballet shoes tied together with their laces and slung over her shoulder. In the dim light from the lobby, he could see the question on her face. She had seen the upset woman, and she knew something was wrong. "It's okay, sweetie," he said, his voice still a little shaky. He walked over to her and knelt down, forcing a smile. "I'm just finishing up. Let's go home." But before they could leave, the frantic woman noticed them. Her eyes, wide and desperate, landed on him, then on the little girl by his side. She hurried over. "I'm so sorry," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't mean for you to see all this. We have a bit of a situation." "It's fine," he said, standing up and moving slightly in front of his daughter, a protective instinct kicking in. "We were just leaving." "Please wait," the woman said, her eyes pleading. She looked exhausted, like she was carrying the weight of the whole evening on her shoulders. "Our opening pianist, a very talented young girl, she's had a panic attack. She's locked herself in the dressing room and she won't come out. We have a small audience already seated and the whole program is timed. I just don't know what to do." She wrung her hands, a gesture of complete helplessness. He felt a pang of sympathy for her. He could see the situation clearly, a full house, a nervous performer, and a whole evening of other people's hard work about to be derailed. He knew that feeling all too well, the pressure of things going wrong when people were counting on you. "That's tough," he said, his voice low. "I hope she feels better." He took his daughter's hand. This was definitely his cue to leave. He was a janitor, a construction worker. He had no place in the world of recitals and performance anxiety. He was just the guy who cleaned up after it was all over. But as he turned to lead his daughter to the truck, she pulled back on his hand. He looked down at her. Her big, bright eyes were fixed on the grand piano, which was visible through the open doors of the auditorium. The stage lights were on now, making the instrument gleam. It looked less like a ghost and more like a throne. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of curiosity and a simple, childlike logic that cut through all the complicated adult emotions in the air. She tugged on his sleeve, a small, insistent gesture. Then she said the words. "Dad," she whispered, her voice clear and certain in the tense quiet of the night. "You could play?" The world stopped. The woman in front of him froze. The air seemed to thicken. He looked down at his daughter's face, at the complete and utter faith shining in her eyes. She wasn't suggesting it as a solution to a problem. She was stating a fact as simple and as true as the sky is blue or the grass is green. In her world, her dad could do anything. He could fix a broken toy, he could build a tree house, and he could sit at that piano and make music. He felt a jolt like an electric current running through his body. The fear from earlier, the memory of the grief, was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. But something else was there too. A warmth spreading from his daughter's small hand in his. He looked from her hopeful face to the desperate, pleading face of the organizer. The woman's eyes had widened, a flicker of a crazy, impossible hope dawning in them as she looked from his daughter to him and back again. A war started inside him. One voice, loud and familiar, screamed at him to run. No, not that piano. Not that music? You're not that person anymore? You'll just embarrass yourself. You're a construction worker, your hands are rough. You haven't played seriously in years. It was the voice of fear. The voice of grief that had kept him silent for so long, but another voice, a quieter one, was starting to speak. It was the voice of the man who wanted to be a hero in his daughter's eyes. It was the voice that remembered the joy of music, not just the pain it was tied to. It was the voice that saw a woman in desperate need of a small miracle. And it was the voice that heard his daughter's simple, powerful statement of faith. You could play. He stood there, caught between two worlds. The past, with all its pain and sorrow, was pulling at him from the stage. The future, standing right beside him, holding his hand, was pulling him toward it. He looked at the piano again. It was still just a wood and wire box. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like an opportunity. A terrifying, impossible, crazy opportunity. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs, and for the first time all night, it didn't feel shaky. It felt steady. He looked at his daughter and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. He was about to do something crazy. The world seemed to hold its breath. The frantic woman beside him stared, her mouth slightly open, her expression a mixture of disbelief and a desperate, fragile hope. But the man wasn't looking at her. His gaze was locked on his daughter, on the unwavering trust in her eyes. In that moment, she wasn't just a little girl in a sparkly leotard. She was his compass, pointing him toward a true north he had forgotten existed. He gave her hand one last, gentle squeeze, a silent promise, and then he let go. His feet felt like they were made of lead as he walked toward the stage doors. Every step was a battle against a voice inside his head that was screaming at him to turn back. Asterisk, you're a fool. You'll embarrass yourself. Your hands are dirty, your clothes are a mess. You don't belong here, asterisk, but with each step, another voice, a quieter one, grew stronger. It was the sound of his daughter's whisper. You could play. He walked through the open doors and into the warm light of the stage. The small audience, maybe 50 people, rustled their programs and whispered to each other. They saw a man in dusty jeans and a worn t-shirt walk towards the grand piano, and a quiet murmur of confusion rippled through the rows. He ignored them. He climbed the 3 steps onto the stage, the familiar wooden floor feeling strange and exposed under the bright lights. The piano sat there, no longer a ghost under a shroud, but a magnificent, gleaming beast waiting for him. It looked both terrifying and beautiful. He reached out and pulled the bench back, the legs scraping softly against the floor. The sound was loud in the quiet hall. He sat down. The bench was cold and hard. He felt the eyes of every single person in the room on him, a physical weight on his shoulders. He was a construction worker, a janitor, a single dad. He was an imposter in this world of polished wood and soft lighting. His hands hovered over the keys for a long moment. His fingers, rough and calloused from gripping shovels and hammers, felt foreign on the smooth, cool ivory. They were not the hands of a pianist. They were hands that built things, that fixed things, that got dirty. What could they possibly create here? He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and thought of her. Not the woman in the hospital bed, but the woman on the bench next to him, laughing. He thought of the simple, clumsy melody they had tried to play together, and then he began. His right thumb pressed down on a single key. A soft, clear C note hung in the air, alone and hesitant. It was a question. He let it fade, then played another. And another. Slowly, carefully, the melody began to take shape. It wasn't a famous or complicated piece. It was a simple folk tune, an old lullaby that had been a favorite of theirs. It was a song that felt like home. At first. His playing was heavy, each note weighted down with years of unshed grief. The melody was slow, almost mournful. He was playing for her, for the ghost. He was telling her he was sorry. He was telling her he missed her. The music was a conversation he had needed to have for years, and every note was a word he hadn't been able to speak. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats, perhaps confused by the raw, unpolished sadness coming from the man on the stage, but then something shifted. As his fingers grew more confident, the memories began to change. He saw her laughing again, her head on his shoulder. He remembered the warmth of the sun on their backs that day. The music began to lift, just a little. The sadness was still there, a deep, resonant bass line under the melody, but now it was joined by something else. A hint of joy. A memory of happiness so pure it hurt. The melody wept, but it also remembered how to laugh. He was no longer just playing for the woman he had lost. He was playing for the life they had shared. His eyes, still closed, scanned the dark hall until he found her. A small shape in the third row, sitting perfectly still, her whole being focused on him. His daughter. The music softened again, the notes becoming gentler, more tender. The lullaby was no longer a song of loss, but a song of love. It was the song he used to hum to her when she was a baby, the same melody his wife had hummed to him. He was playing for her now. He was pouring all the fierce, protective, overwhelming love he felt for his child into the music. He was telling her that everything would be okay, that she was his anchor, his reason, his everything. The audience was completely still now. The confused whispers had died out, replaced by a profound, shared silence. People leaned forward in their seats. A woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. An old man took off his glasses and rubbed his face. They weren't just hearing a song anymore. They were feeling a story. They could feel the grief in the heavy chords, the love in the gentle melody, the resilience in the way the music kept going, even when it was clearly painful. They understood they were witnessing something deeply private, a soul laid bare. This wasn't a performance. It was an exorcism. The music began to build, not in volume, but in emotion. It was the climax of the story, the moment of release. All the pain, all the love, all the years of silence came rushing out through his fingers and into the strings of the piano. It was a torrent of feeling, a catharsis played out in C major. He wasn't thinking about the notes or the timing. He was just a conduit, a vessel for a heart that could finally speak again. And then, as gently as it began, it started to fade. The melody became simpler, the notes softer, until he was playing just a single, repeating line. It was a farewell, a letting go. He played one last, soft chord and let his hands rest on the keys, allowing the sound to vibrate up his arms and into his heart. The final note faded into a silence that was more powerful, more meaningful than any applause. It was a reverent, holy silence that filled the hall, thick with unspoken emotion. No one moved. No one breathed. They just sat there, holding the moment, feeling the echo of the story they had just been told. The man on the bench kept his eyes closed, his head bowed, his rough hands still resting on the ivory keys. He was empty, but he was also whole. He had played for his past, and he had played for his future. And in doing so, he had finally found his peace. The silence in the hall was a living thing. It stretched and grew, filling every corner with the weight of what had just been shared. It was so profound that the man on the bench, his head still bowed, wondered for a moment if he had gone deaf. The world had been reduced to the feeling of the smooth keys under his rough fingers and the memory of the last, vibrating string fading into nothing. He was empty, but it was a good kind of empty, like a cup that has been poured out so it can be filled again. He had spoken the words he couldn't say for years, and now there was nothing left. Then from the back of the hall, a single sound broke the spell. It was the soft clap of an older man's hands, slow and deliberate. Not a burst of excitement, but a gesture of deep, heartfelt respect. For a moment, it was the only sound. Then a woman near the front joined in, her hands pressed together as if in prayer. Another person followed, and then another. It wasn't a wave of thunderous applause that swept through the auditorium. It was a quiet, growing tide of appreciation, a gentle rain of acknowledgement for a storm that had passed. The sound was not for a performer. It was for a soul that had been brave enough to be seen. The sound finally reached him, and he flinched as if waking from a dream. He lifted his head and blinked, his eyes slowly adjusting to the bright stage lights. He saw the faces in the audience, and they were not the faces of critics. They were the faces of fellow travelers, many with damp cheeks and glistening eyes. They were looking at him not with judgment, but with a shared, unspoken understanding. He saw the frantic organizer near the side of the stage, her hands clasped to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. But he wasn't looking for her. His eyes scanned the rows, searching for the one face that mattered, and there she was. In the third row, a small figure standing on her seat to see over the person in front of her. Her face was a mess of tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, unfiltered pride. Her smile was so wide it seemed to take up her whole face, a beacon of light that cut through the dimness of the hall and found him right where he sat. In that moment, the applause, the organizer, the entire audience faded away. There was only him and his daughter. He slowly, carefully, lifted his hands from the keys. He felt a strange sense of loss as his fingers left the ivory, but it was quickly replaced by a warmth spreading through his chest. He stood up from the bench, his legs a little stiff. He did not bow. He did not wave. He wasn't a performer taking a final curtain call. He was just a dad who had finished a song. He simply turned and began to walk off the stage, towards the aisle where his daughter was waiting as he moved. The people in the seats closest to the aisle began to stand, not to block his path, but to make way for him. It was a silent, collective gesture of respect. They parted like a sea, creating a clear path for him. He walked between them, a man in dusty jeans and a worn t-shirt, feeling more exposed and more accepted than he had in his entire life. He reached the aisle, and his daughter launched herself into his arms. He caught her, lifting her small body and holding her tight. She buried her face in his neck, her small shoulders shaking with happy sobs. He held her, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid, real weight of her in his arms. This was his anchor. This was his reward. "You were amazing, Dad," she whispered. Her voice muffled by his shirt, he squeezed her tighter, his own eyes stinging. "No, sweetie," he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my amazing girl." He set her down, but kept her hand firmly in his. The organizer rushed over, her face a mixture of awe and gratitude. That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard," she stammered, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. "I don't know how to thank you." "We have to pay you, of course. Please, let me write you a check." The man shook his head, a small, genuine smile finally touching his lips. It felt strange, like using a muscle he hadn't moved in years. "No, thank you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm just a dad." The organizer looked at him, then at the little girl holding his hand, and she understood. She nodded slowly, her expression softening. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, you are." He gave her a small nod of thanks and then led his daughter down the aisle and out into the lobby. The cool night air washed over them as they stepped outside, a welcome relief from the heat of the stage lights and the intensity of the emotion. The world seemed sharper, more vibrant. The stars in the sky seemed brighter. He felt a lightness in his chest, as if a heavy stone he had been carrying for so long had finally been rolled away. They walked to his old truck in comfortable silence. He didn't need to ask her what she thought. He already knew. He helped her into her seat and climbed into the driver's side. The engine rumbled to life, a familiar, comforting sound. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he glanced over at his daughter. She was looking out the window, a small, contented smile on her face, her ballet shoes still tied together and dangling from her backpack. He reached over and gave her hand a squeeze. She squeezed back without looking away from the window. Everything was okay. Everything was more than okay. When they got home, the house was quiet and still, just as they had left it. The normalcy of it all was a balm. He made her a small glass of warm milk, and they sat together at their small kitchen table. They didn't talk about the performance. They didn't need to. They talked about her day at school, about a funny thing a friend had said, about what they might do on Saturday. The extraordinary event of the evening was settling into the comfortable fabric of their ordinary life, not as a dramatic climax, but as a new, colorful thread woven into the pattern. Later, after he had tucked her into bed and kissed her goodnight, he walked into the living room. His eyes fell on a corner of the room, where a small, dusty electronic keyboard had been sitting for years, untouched. It was a cheap thing he had bought for her on a whim, thinking she might want to learn, but she had chosen dance instead. It had become just another piece of furniture, a silent reminder of a forgotten intention. He walked over to it. He ran his finger over the plastic keys, leaving a clean line in the dust. He thought of the grand piano on the stage, the weight of its keys, the richness of its sound. He thought of the woman he had lost and the daughter he had found. He thought of the music that had been a bridge between his past and his present. He heard a small sound behind him. He turned to see his daughter standing in the doorway of her room, her teddy bear in her arms. She had been watching him. "Dad," she said, her voice soft, "can you teach me how to play?" He looked at the dusty keyboard, then at his daughter's hopeful face. The ghost of the melody was no longer a source of pain. It was a gift. A gift he could now give to her. He smiled, a real, full smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I think I can." And for the first time in a long time, the future felt like a song, waiting to be played.